In Tibet itself, the tradition was then maintained and passed on in several ways. Besides manuscripts, the printers used blocks of carved wood, and many Sanskrit texts that disappeared in India during the Muslim invasions have been conserved in the Tibetan version. Works of art were also a means to convey knowledge. An artist, whether sculptor, engraver, or painter, could never have conceived of expressing his own profane aspirations, his dreams, his desires, his fantasies, or his torments. As in Egypt, at the time of the pharaohs, and in Europe during the Romanesque or Gothic period, anonymous art transmitted laws, truths, a complete teaching, and an extremely strict iconography specifies the attributes and the colors of the tantric deities, these symbols of the great forces that drive the universe and give life to every human being. The Tibetan paintings on fabric, despite or perhaps because of the requirements imposed on their painters, are in most cases of great beauty. However, in Tibet, as in India, or with the Muslim Sufis, the essence of the transmission of spiritual influence is the chain of masters and disciples. Outsiders have the habit of calling all monks and Tibetan ascetics Lama, whereas it should apply only to the true gurus, such as Kangyo Rinpoche, qualified to initiate disciples and then to guide them on the path to liberation. There are many different types of master. Each one has attained complete inner freedom, which gives him perfect liberty to undertake any task, even that of building a small temple or a stupa, as is the case for Chatral Rinpoche. The type of succession which is particular to Tibetan Buddhism is that of these masters, chosen from childhood and called tulkus. This is why, led by Kalu Rinpoche, these monks are performing before this child, Tai Situ Rinpoche, a ceremony that is common to all forms of Buddhism, the ceremony where they confess to the breach of monastic regulations. They do so, absolutely certain that they prostrate themselves before the continuation of a master who appeared for the first time on earth years or centuries ago. The English word reincarnation is a rather unsuitable translation of the Buddhist notion of a predecessor and a successor. Imagine that at the death of St. Bernard of Clairvaux or St. Francis of Assisi, the Cistercian and Franciscan monks searched for and recognized in another human being the qualities that personified the founders of their orders. Thus, the active wisdom of St. Bernard or the infinite compassion of St. Francis would be perpetuated down to the present day through generations of new incarnations. But not all young monks are tulkus, and many Tibetans who were not recognized as a Lama at a very young age join monasteries in their childhood. To be frank, some were there just to swell the ranks during the services. Others studied for years the texts, the holy incantations or mantras, the ritual gestures or mudras, and practiced unceasingly self-discipline and meditation. Tibet was not so isolated from the rest of Asia as has often been described, even though it was surrounded by notorious deserts that were hostile to the caravans and by mountains that were hard to cross. Tibet was particularly influenced by India and China, but in turn influenced its neighboring countries, Mongolia, Ladakh, Bhutan, and Sikkim. Sikkim in particular, although today the country is closed for military reasons, has been a meeting place between Western civilization and Tibetan tradition for the last 100 years.
Tesumsangi guru rumbuchi mudukunda dawachimbish pajagosa tendita with swords of chingilaps chinasana pajeshivata sambalingi to chingilap.
Sikkim, under the direction of its king, welcomed the Tibetan orders called Red Hats, or non-reformed, whether Nyingmapa or Kalkyupa. The invocations that millions of voices and prayer wheels have repeated in Tibet for centuries still resound today around the great stupa of Gangtok. Om Mani Padme Hum. The stupas, called Churten in Tibetan, are the most representative monuments of Buddhism as a whole. They are built to shelter relics, and their architecture, composed of 5 stories, is a book of metaphysics in itself. The 5 Dhyani Buddhas, or refractions of the Absolute, the 5 constituents of the human being, the 5 passions that can be transformed, the 5 perfections. The whole of Buddhism is symbolized here. Even those who are unable to express the elements of wisdom themselves can feel at the deepest level that life has a meaning, that the Absolute is compassion itself. They too take refuge in the promise of ultimate perfection for every being, and hail the jewel in the lotus, Om Mani Padme Hum. Near the ancient monastery in Rumtek, 15 kilometers from Gangtok, the disciples and followers of the great master Karmapa are constructing a temple on exactly the same lines as the Tibetan temples. I take the opportunity of these images to pay homage to Sonam Topge Kazi, my collaborator and interpreter. It is a work of faith, for hundreds of people have come down from the mountains to work here, voluntarily. Tibetans, Nepalese, Bhutanese, and Sikkimese work fraternally together. In India itself, only one temple has been completed by refugees, the one in Mussoorie, which was decorated by Tibetan artists. But near Kalimpong, the Sherpas and friends of the famous Sherpa Tenzing, the first man to conquer Everest, did not overestimate their strength or their faith, but rather their material resources. Through lack of financial aid, their temple remains unfinished, like the ruins of their shattered expectations and their unshakable hope. In Tibet, some of the big monasteries housed several thousand monks. They were divided into faculties, and generally, a medical faculty was included. Among the few who survived from the monasteries, some were able to retreat into India. In Dharamsala, a group of Lama doctors was formed with the intention of maintaining and teaching traditional Tibetan medicine. I have been told that it takes 9 years to qualify as a doctor and 12 to become an excellent doctor. Considering that medical studies demand a thorough learning of thousands of pages by heart, it is not too early to start as a child.